Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk through some guidance for Edexcel A Level History Paper 3, Section C, which is the breadth essays. So my other video on general essay writing techniques and A-star tips, those two videos also apply to Section C. This one is just talking about some of the kind of quirks of Section C and some of the things to keep in mind for this specific section of paper 3. So these are the breadth essays that generally cover the whole period of the paper. So, and they're usually kind of turning points questions, which is why I've got that turning point sign there. So here is what I'm going to run through in this video. Just going to go through some general guidance, then go through some feedback from examiners' reports, look at an exemplar paragraph, talk about the kind of synoptic language that you can use to help you get to the top level of the mark scheme, look at a sample plan, like a general essay plan for Section C, and then go through a checklist that I've made to help you with Section C. And there's a graph here of kind of human history. And the way that I think about Section C and something that really helps me understand this is by thinking about it as a graph. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. So here we go now, talking about some general guidance. So really the thing to remember with Section C is that it's about big picture kind of macro analysis of the topic, the period in question. So it's like the depth questions are going into detail, like looking at things under a microscope. The Section C, the breadth questions, are a real big, taking a step back and having this kind of synoptic overview. So just to illustrate that, here's a graph that I've used on a course I used to teach about workers' rights in the USA over, the late 19th and 20th centuries. And so here's a graph of union membership in the USA. And so if you're taking this step back, you should be able to explain why there are these kind of high points and then these drops in union membership. So for example, just looking at this, you can see around about the times of the two world wars in the 20th century, there's really big kind of peaks of union membership. So then you've got that synoptic analysis, the big picture of, okay, we can see some themes here. And then it kind of drops off, in the later 20th century. So having this big picture overview is really, really important. So if you haven't already got some kind of graphs put together on Section C, I would, on the topics in Section C, I would strongly recommend that you do that. Putting a graph together on the changes that have taken place. Similarly, something else you need to think about is links over time. So again, having this bigger picture overview, not going into it in depth in the same way that you do with Section B in paper 3. So what I mean by links over time is showing how something set a precedent or laid the foundation for something that came later. So for example, in the paper 3 that I teach at the moment, Civil Rights in the USA, 1850 to 2009. Here's an example. So you've got Booker T. Washington, very prominent African-American in the late 19th century, who advocated Black American self-determination. Okay, so you could be talking about Booker T. Washington. You say this set a precedent for later on. You've got Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, similarly advocating Black American self-determination. So you can see that Booker T. Washington kind of sowed the seed, laid the foundations for the later work of Garvey. And then moving on, Garvey influenced Malcolm X in the 1960s. And then finally, Malcolm X influenced the Black Panthers. And so you can see this idea of African-American self-determination has actually quite a long route. It doesn't start with Malcolm X, it goes back. And so if you've got that kind of those links over time and trying to weave those into your essays and show how there are these similarities and continuities over time, that can really, really help. So just have a look at your notes on what you've got for the topics in Section C and think about what are the similarities? Are there any links that I can make over time? Trying to put those into your essays can really, really help. So big picture analysis, thinking about it, taking a step back as a kind of graph, and then making these links over time. So here are some points from the examiner's reports. So looking at a few examiner's reports on paper 3 and section C specifically, it says that to get to level 5, and it did explicitly say this in the 2019 examiner's report, you need to cover at least 75% of the stated period. So for the paper 3 that I teach, Civil Rights in the USA, 1850 to 2009, 75% of 159 years works out at about 120 years. So to get to the top level, to get an A star, in other words, you need to cover 120 years in your essay. So when you are planning your essay and you're thinking about what your paragraphs are going to be focused on, that should be one of the most important factors that you take into account when you're planning your essay. Okay, have I covered 120 years here? You know, am I going to be talking about things from across the period, not just focusing on a small part of this? And it says 60% for level 4. So really, really factor that into your essay planning. When you're doing essay plans for revision, factor that in, cover the period. We're going to talk more about this in a minute. But the second point is the approach. So it says pick out 4 or more key changes or turning points, and then provide an analysis of the target aspect of change or turning point in the question, setting its importance against other aspects rather than providing a description of each. So it's not about describing the turning points, it's about comparing them back with the question and having this broad overview. And again, I'll go through this when I show you a kind of sample plan. So covering over 75% and then analyzing the different turning points or the factors against each other rather than just describing them. Okay, so here's an exemplar paragraph, this one that was provided by the exam board, talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel being a key turning point in the shaping of race relations in the United States in the years 1850 to 2009. And what I really wanted to highlight here, and you can potentially pause this and read through that in your own time, is just the reason why I think this has been chosen as a top level answer is because of the synoptic assessment. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight the key kind of terms and phrases that really show what I'm talking about here. So it says, on the one hand, Uncle Tom's Cabin can be said to be the key turning point. So it's engaging with the key term in the question, this idea of turning point, as it was the first novel of its kind. So it's really saying this is unprecedented, to address the growing anti-slavery feeling in the USA and spawned many later pro-African American viewpoints. So it's saying it kind of sets a precedent. Yeah. The novel was the first to really humanize the experience of slavery. Again, the first of its kind. It's unprecedented, in a way taken up and emphasized in later novels like Beloved. So again, it's setting a precedent. It's influencing later works. And then just moving on to the next section I've underlined, the novel has retained resonance into the 20th and 21st centuries, and it talks about Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes. So it's showing its impact over time. It's not just, it does say at the time how important Uncle Tom's Cabin was, but it's not just focusing on that. It's not just saying, oh, it sold lots in the mid-19th century. It's talking about its impact over time. And that's really the key thing to do with section C. Okay, and so then just look at the summary at the end. It says, thus, overall, the novel was a key turning point as it was the first of its kind, spawning others in the same ilk, and also forced all Americans, North and South, to read it to fall on one side of the slavery arguments, increasing division. So showing why it was significant at the time and how it laid the foundations for future change. So that's synoptic assessment. So thinking about using terms like that, it laid the foundations, it's unprecedented, those kind of things. On that note, here is some language that you should try and use in your essays. And I've done a video on A-star tips, which give more A-star tips, which apply to section C breadth essays. for paper 3. But here are some specific ones for these breadth essays. So things like, talking about something as a turning point is unprecedented, something that lays the foundation, something that's a catalyst, something that's transformative. Using these kind of language, these kind of phrases can really help boost your analysis beyond just saying this was important, this is significant, going beyond that. And again, it's about that synoptic assessment, having that big picture overview, taking a step back rather than going in so much detail like you do with the depth essays. Okay, so you can take a note of those. You could try and kind of put some of those in your essay plans, putting some of those into your arguments when you're planning essays as well. Next up is a kind of sample plan for section C. So the way that I normally suggest is still I suggest intro, 3 paragraphs, and conclusion. For section C, you might want to have more than 3 paragraphs. You might want to have 4, say, because you are covering much broader period. So I've just put 3 here because that's what I had space for on the slide, but you could definitely do 4 so that you get that coverage of 75% as it suggests. So if the question was something like, how far do you do that X was the most significant turning point? In your intro, you're talking about the context, 1850 to 2009, or whatever it is for your paper 3. And then you would need to define in this one, turning point, what do we mean? So again, it could be something that's unprecedented, something that lays the foundation or has a significant impact later. And then your argument in your intro, was it X? Was it the turning point in the question? If it was, why? If not, which one was it? And why was it the other one and not X? So having a basis for your argument. Again, I go through these things in the general essay writing tips video. And then you obviously start with the one in the question. So you talk about X, turning point X, give some analysis, give some evidence, you analyze that. Again, aim for maybe 3 pieces of evidence per paragraph with analysis throughout. And then the summary is really, really important. How important was X, comparing it to others? Again, taking this big picture overview. Then paragraphs 2 and 3 talk about other turning points. Again, you might have a 4th paragraph talking about other turning points. And it's really important just to note at the bottom here, the summary at the end of each paragraph, linking it back to X, comparing it back to the one in the question is really, really, really important. So if we go back to this question on Uncle Tom's Cabin, in every other paragraph, you're comparing the other works that you choose back to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, so if the turning point is the 1920s, you compare back to the 1920s. And then in conclusion, answer the question, was it X? Was it the turning point in the question? If so, why was it X? If not, why was it something else? Again, that synoptic assessment is really, really important. Maybe one had a longer term impact than the other, than all the others. Finally, here is a checklist you can look at that could help you when you're planning section C for paper 3. So have you consistently linked back to the question, so the turning point and the criteria. So whatever you use, if you say a turning point, it means something that was unprecedented, something that had a transformative impact, those kind of things, you need to link back to that throughout the question. Have you used evidence from across the period? So 75%. So what I would do for whichever paper 3 you do, work out what 75% of it is. And as I've done here for civil rights, it's 120 years. If you do a different paper, what are the dates and what's 75% of that? Work it out. So make sure you cover at least 75%. And then at the end of each paragraph, have you weighed up the relative importance of each period or factor? Okay. You could potentially do these essays by time period, like early, middle, late, and then compare them in that way. But the main thing is just going right back to the start, having this big picture macro analysis, making links over time. Okay, so seeing that really big picture with section C, not going into things in in the same level of detail as you do with the depth essays, taking a step back, that big picture overview. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Thanks.